coming. I'm going to briefly present the project I worked on in France, which was looking at conservation of genetic diversity in red wheat varieties and also the development of new wheat varieties adapted to organic farms in Europe, particularly France. And this is the group I worked with. It's a long list of authors, but students, farmers, and researchers. So the context in Europe is a little bit different than in the States. There are a lot of similarities, but particularly the regulatory system is different. Varieties, in order to be commercialized, need to be on an official list, a catalog of registered varieties. And in order to be put on this list, they need to meet certain criteria for distinctness, uniformity, and stability, which are the UPOV descriptors. It means that really only pure line varieties can be registered with the catalog. And most countries, in addition to the distinctness, uniformity, and stability criteria, also have a value for cultivation and use standard, which means that the variety needs to be tested 3 years. In conventional systems, most countries don't have a low input or organic testing track. So the varieties are tested in conventional high input systems. For yield, there's a little bit of weight on disease resistance, but primarily it's yield. So varieties that are adapted to organic systems usually don't pass this. And because the market is smaller, the process is expensive, seed companies don't see the benefit in trying to register varieties for organic agriculture. So farmers are faced with a real shortage of varieties because they don't have anything adapted to organic systems, and it's illegal to exchange seed or try to use varieties that aren't registered unless you're saving your own seed on your own farm or you're involved in a research project and exchanging very small quantities of seed. So the way farmers have dealt with this is to start trying, they start trying varieties in the catalog. They don't find something that meets their needs. And then they try land races, public domain varieties that they can get from the gene bank. And one of the reasons, obviously the agronomics are very different in organic systems, but they also are looking for a very different quality because most of the organic farmers are trying to use a direct marketing or a very short marketing chain rather than a wholesale approach. There are wholesale organic farmers who are using some of the modern varieties. The farmers we worked with are generally not in the major wheat producing regions, and so their strategy is to mill and bake on farm or to work very closely with a miller and a baker in order to commercialize their product locally and get a lot higher value for the grains that they grow. So the characteristics they're looking for are both high yields, weed competitiveness, disease resistance. Yields, while they want them to be as high as possible, they're not the driving factor. The driving factor really is quality. And because they're using an artisanal process, they don't need the modern varieties with a very high protein and strong gluten. They're looking for a variety that has taste and also one that has good quality for a long fermentation and a bread that's whole wheat or whole emmer or einkorn. They're using whole grain flours, and that quality is considerably different than the varieties that are registered in the official catalog. So that kind of gives the context. When they started trying to find varieties that met their needs, they realized, first of all, that there's a lot more diversity in wheat varieties in the gene bank and wheat varieties that they can find from older farmers and farming communities than they ever thought possible. And also that this diversity is really threatened, both because farmers aren't using them anymore and because of the seed laws that prohibit seed exchange and the use of non-registered varieties. So the association I worked with, the Réseau Semences Paysannes, which means the Farmer Seed Network, was created in 2003 in order to facilitate exchange among farmers. If they're part of an official association involved in research and conservation, they're allowed to exchange small quantities of seed. And also to raise awareness about the need to conserve genetic diversity in agricultural species. And on the right there is a display at the National Ag Expo about how seed regulations prohibit seed saving and the need to really change the regulations in order to allow on-farm conservation. They also realized that a lot of these varieties they get out of the gene bank don't meet all of their needs. The diseases have changed, the agricultural systems have changed, so there's a lot of interest in developing their own varieties. The network started on-farm trials before they really got involved with the research team. They've grouped together to get small seeders, small combines. They help each other with the trial management and data collection. These are all on-farm trials of historic and landrace wheat varieties. And I can tell you a lot of the on-farm trials are much better managed than the research station trials. So we got better data from this stuff than from the ones on station. They do their own statistical analysis, publish the results. Here you can see they've tried a number of, is there a pointer?
No, that really won't work. You
Okay.
have to use the...
All right, so they've tried a number of older varieties. They found ones that are high yielding. It says productive wheat that don't lodge. That the yield is about 3 tons per hectare on very poor soil. And that's probably about 45 bushels an acre. Then they find ones that are high yielding, but you have to be careful about lodging. Ones that don't yield very much, they have problems with rust. And then the modern varieties. This one was developed for organic agriculture. It was put through the conventional process, but the idea was that it was low input and organic. It's the best yielding of the modern ones, but still some of the older varieties are more productive and have much better quality and better biomass production, which is important to farmers that also have dairy cows or that are looking to build their organic matter in the soil. So the research team got involved with the Farming Association to begin with, to look at the genetic diversity, the on-farm conservation and genetic diversity. And it wasn't to start developing varieties right away, but to recognize the role of farmers in conserving the genetic diversity that we'll need for future breeding and selection. This gave them legal status. In some ways, they're now recognized under the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, and really allowed them to continue their work without being constantly harassed by the National Seed Office. So this was a study of a lot of what's called the neutral genetic diversity, which is just DNA markers that are a fingerprint of the genetic diversity within lines. This is one wheat variety, so a single name. There were 2 distinct seed sources that we looked at. The links are from farmer interviews where they got their seed. Each of these is a population. The colored ones are the ones that were sampled. So the one population came from a farming community that had never been conserved in a gene bank. The other one came from a seed company that was then given to the gene bank, and so farmers got it from the gene bank. And so looking at the neutral genetic diversity, we saw that there were 2 distinct groups. So qualitatively, there were complementary groups of genetic diversity, and also that the farmer network, this is the gene bank sample. So this is a measure of how much diversity there is. It's at 0. This is all the populations in the network, and you see that there's a lot more genetic diversity conserved by a lot of farmers actually growing these in the field, harvesting them, and replanting them every year. So the European Union got interested in this in situ or on-farm conservation genetic diversity and funded a study to look at farmers' varieties with the idea that this would inform policy on a new catalog of conservation varieties that would have different standards for registration and would encourage farmers to grow older varieties, land races, that might not yield as much, but that were valuable for their qualities, for their baking quality, and also for the genetic diversity that they represent. So the farmers involved in the project each chose a variety that they were already cultivating, that they liked for the agronomic and quality aspects, and that they wanted to share with other farmers in Europe. There were 2 in Italy who each chose a landrace from Italy, Piave and Solina, 4 in France that chose landraces from France. This is the one that was studied for the neutral genetic diversity, and then 2 in the Netherlands that chose varieties from the Netherlands. There were also 2 modern Czechs. Aubusson was a commercial Czech developed for conventional agriculture, and Renan is the one that was developed for low-input agriculture. So each farmer sent their variety to all the other farmers. In each farm, all the varieties were cultivated 2 years, so 2005 to 2006, 2006 to 2007. This is winter wheat, so it spans 2 years. And then the last year, we again recirculated all the seed, so they had a variety from the region of origin compared to a variety that had evolved 2 years on the farm. And we also took all the varieties that had evolved on the farm and put them in a common garden experiment. So the idea was to see whether varieties stayed distinct or whether they changed a lot when they changed from their region of origin to other places, whether they were stable, and whether they could be described in a way that could be registered in the catalog. Again, this was to inform policy, so the mandate was fairly narrow. We looked at the catalog kind of descriptors. So this is, these are results from the Common Garden experiment where we had all the farmers' versions of all the varieties planted together. We looked at all the traits we measured, spike length, plant height, the things that go into catalog registration, and we saw if the varieties stayed distinct. And what came out was that while there was some differentiation in terms of mean values, if you looked at all the traits together, you definitely saw each variety clustering together. So Rouge, Bordeaux, Bordeaux. There were 2 exceptions. This one from the region of origin, which turned out to be a seed mix at harvest the year before. And this one, which came from a different source. So what we recommended to the EU was that varieties stayed distinct and that something like this could be used to catch mistakes or to see when varieties no longer fit their description. But the bigger conclusion was that the catalog for conservation varieties only really met the needs of a small section of the genetic diversity that is out there. Certain farmers want to conserve a landrace exactly as it is, fitting into this description of what it used to be. And that's good for certain market segments. But in other cases, farmers really want to develop their own variety, and there's no regulatory framework for that right now. We looked at, this is from the on-farm results. So we looked at what actually changed on-farm, whether natural selection actually pushed varieties towards better adaptation in each region. Quick explanation here. This is plant height on farm. The gray bars are the seed sample from the region of origin that was planted. The green bars are that variety that evolved for 2 years on the farm. And then the brown bars are when farmers made selections. So what we saw for plant height is that there was no real directional selection, just harvesting and replanting. But farmers always chose plants that were taller than average, that hadn't fallen down. So you can get too tall and then lodge, but the farmers increased the height, but chose plants that were resistant to lodging. With grain weight, the same thing. Natural selection really didn't increase grain weight over 2 years, but farmers selected spikes that were above average for grain weight. This, of course, shows that farmers obviously chose plants that were better adapted to their environment. The longer-term response to selection, though, depends on that maintaining itself. And so what we saw in the following years is that this now, is the unselected version from 2 farmers, the unselected version and then the selected versions from 2 farmers. And the letters show significant differences. So then plant height, you saw that there was a significant increase in progeny for Rouge de Bordeaux, but not for the Redon or the Renan. And Renan we didn't expect because it was a pure line variety, so most of the selection would have been on environmental variation. The same thing with grain weight. Rouge de Bordeaux responded to selection, the other 2 didn't. And so what we hypothesized is that the Rouge de Bordeaux really has a lot of genetic variation within the population. It was never conserved in a gene bank, and it's had the opportunity to really diversify from an original population in the farmers' network. Redon came out of a gene bank a lot more recently. It was initially 7 individuals, and it may not have that much genetic diversity to actually respond to selection. And Renan, of course, is a pure line, so it theoretically has almost no genetic variation. So this kind of led to the question, if you have land races that come out of a gene bank, do you have enough genetic diversity to really develop local adaptation, to develop a variety that does well in a certain environment if that's not where it's adapted to begin with? And the farmers' network then wanted to start a participatory rebreeding project. The idea was to create more diverse populations by crossing, by mixing varieties, and then conduct selection on each interested farmer's farm. The network spans all of France, so there's a lot of environmental heterogeneity. It's unlikely that a variety selected in the south of France will do well in the north of France, and vice versa. And the idea is that this is also a way to manage diversity very dynamically, so that within the network, you may have a lot of varieties that are specifically adapted to certain climates, but throughout the group of farmers, you maintain a large range of genetic diversity for traits that are of interest agriculturally and in terms of baking quality. The research project is both to develop varieties and also to understand how genetic diversity in crops interacts with diversity in the rest of the system, rotations, soil biodiversity. There are a number of different research teams involved. We started with about 90 crosses that were distributed in the 3rd generation to a number of farmers. And then, so 15 farms started, and the next year a number of other farms joined. The farmers chose the parents to cross. All the evaluation and selection was done on farm. And there were some studies on the research station to look at the response to selection, which we saw more response than in the land races, but I'm not going to go into those results yet. Mostly what I want to talk about is the framework for this kind of project. We started with trials all over France. Each one was an individual trial. We had replicated checks. But it was very difficult to actually analyze these together in a way that farmers could use the results and the selections from their neighbors. It was also difficult for the farmers to manage this kind of trial because it had to be the same from one farm to the next. And it was difficult for us to collect the data excuse me, because it was a couple of us taking the train all over the place and trying to measure everything. No, I should be okay. So the following year, after discussing the trial management with the farmers, we adopted a system that was originally developed in Africa for agronomic trials, participatory agronomic trials by SIG-SNAP, where you have a series of regional trials which have a more complete or a larger set of populations or treatments. Sorry. And then around each of these regional trials, there are a number of satellite trials where each farmer is able to choose what most interests them. There's a lot more flexibility. And with checks in the satellite trials that correspond to checks on the regional platforms, they're able to use the information that comes from the regional trial. And then all the regional trials can be analyzed together to get a national picture. And then on the research station, we're able to make crosses and start the early generation where you have very little seed. It's difficult to do crosses on farm because of weather conditions, because flowering happens during haying, and it's very tricky to get all the logistics right. So the research station can manage the crosses. The farmers choose the parents, which is really the most important step. And after that, the crossing is fairly simple. Again, the crosses go to farms that choose the parents. The ones that they like are then put on a regional trial so other people can see. Farmers come to the regional trial in the summer and do selections. They choose what they want to take back to their farm. And they also discuss with the farmers in the region what looks good, what doesn't, what they want to try, what other farmers have seen on satellite trials. We've had very good discussions at the field days. And then farmers can take it back to their farm and eventually start multiplying seed. Because these exchanges are allowed in the context of a research program. But if you're talking about growing a field of something, you have to really produce your own seed because you're not allowed to give it to anybody and you're not allowed to buy it from anybody. And unfortunately in France, the enforcement of those rules is left up to a group that represents the seed industry. So the farmers end up having audits for 2 days in their kitchen where they take out all their records, and you have to be pretty careful. So the advantage is here, this project really grew out of a farmer network that wanted to add this to on-farm conservation activities. It can also be added to an existing plant breeding program that wants to expand and meet new markets or really address needs of farmers that are not well served by the conventional seed system. In addition to developing varieties, it maintains this kind of active source pool of genetic diversity that's always being subject to existing environmental conditions, new diseases, new needs of farmers who are changing their agricultural system, who are trying to access new markets. Particularly in France, where the seed regulations are so strict, this allows farmers to have more autonomy and more choice in their varieties. They're not limited to the catalog because they're able to select their own varieties. They have figured out how to produce very high quality seed and to maintain populations that are adapted to their farm. And in terms of scientific relevance, it helps us develop methods and understand better how crop populations can adapt to climate change, to agricultural challenges, and really gives us a base to change agriculture so that we can meet new environmental concerns and new social and economic, get farmers access to new markets. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who contributed, especially the farmers and the ressourcements paysans, the farmers that were particularly involved, Florent Mercier, Jean-François Berthelot, and Patrick Decotco, the team at INRA, and the rest of the European project partners.
I should have explained, the format we're going to use is if you have questions particularly about what she just presented, we'll take a few minutes right now. And then at the end, we really do want to have much more of a discussion interactively, so we'll have at least 15, 20 minutes at the end for that. So entertain questions for her first.
Sorry about the cough.
Yeah.
Any questions? Well, if you're like me, you're thinking about how does this pertain to what we want to do here in this country? And I guess that was the main thing I kept thinking was, and tell me if this is something you'd like to talk about more at the end of the session. But it was like, well, what do you see here that we are doing or not doing that you wish we would do here?
Now, these grains were being processed either on farm or very close to the farm.
Right.
What kind of, were they making bread out of all of it, or what was the range of products that they were making?
Some farmers were selling flour directly. There were a couple farmers selling whole berries, emmer and einkorn especially. Most farmers were making some kind of bread or working with a baker directly.
And were the einkorns winter or spring varieties?
Most of the varieties grown in France are winter. The ones that would be spring are the ones in the mountains where they get a really difficult winter. But even there, farmers try to grow winter varieties. In southern France, certainly they don't get much of a winter, and so they're facultative, but they plant them in November.
Any other questions? Get your brains working.
Some of your questions will be answered at the last bit.
Yes.
I figured that too.
I just have one comment. Thank you. I also had the chance to spend time in France as a research cooperator through EU funding starting in '05. And what really struck me with the French farmer bakers is their incredible generosity and helping of each other. That this is something that is sort of like the heart of this project, is that they really shared seed in a trusting way with each other, and when one farmer had a crop failure, the other farmers kicked in and gave seed back. Jean-François, he mentioned to me that that happened to him. And I think that it's a very inspiring thing.
They seem to have much more of a group approach than I saw out in Washington. And I think some of that is part of the culture. Like when something goes wrong, they all go on strike. But it also, I think, is because the regulatory system is so restrictive. They really have to band together if they want access to these varieties.
Yes.
So your research there being affiliated with Cornell, US, does that lend credibility to their projects and their research, or is that wave a flag for the seed industry to pay attention?
Well, I wasn't associated with Cornell when I was over there. I was actually an employee of the French National Ag Research Institute. Being an American started, as a little bit of a hurdle, but after I, answered questions about Monsanto, they understood that I was really not on Monsanto's side, despite being an American. Things went pretty well. I don't think the seed industry made any note that I was there.